All right, welcome everyone to this month's SEA Development Seminar. My name is Leslie Buxton. I'm a member of the Development Committee as part of the Staff Employee Association, and I would just want to welcome you and thank you for being here today. I'm going to quickly introduce our speaker, Troy Beckert. We're really excited to have him here today. And just a few housekeeping items. Please make sure and keep yourself on mute for the duration of the session today, unless you have a question. And we'll be monitoring the chat throughout the session, so feel free to write any questions in there that you have. And we'll be running today from 12 to 1 for the entire presentation, and then we'll have 1 to 1:15 for you to ask any questions of Troy and for him to answer those. So I'm going to go ahead and read his bio for you here for a bit, and then we'll get going. So Troy is a professor in the Human Development and Family Studies, or HDFS, department here at the university. His interests in adolescent development shape a research focus in intergenerational learning, autonomy, and psychosocial issues. His current direction of research allows for contextual assessments, including families, cultures, and technology. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you, Troy. Thanks so much.
Well, excellent. Thank you. And welcome, everyone. I got to say, I wish this was not on Zoom because I'd like to see everybody's faces. But, you know, we're doing the best with what we have before us. And thank you to Leslie and Kalu for their invitation to participate with you on this. I'm always amazed in the goings in the university that I didn't even realize were happening. Like, you know, as Leslie announced that this was the monthly, I didn't even know there was one. I thought this was the only thing you've ever done was with me. So it's a privilege to be a part of your group and to be able to spend a little bit of time discussing, I think, a really important topic. So just by way of introduction, maybe if this is going to work, maybe it's not going to work. There we go. Okay. By way of introduction, I do want you all to know where I sit. There is going to come a day when all of us from Generation X are going to break out of our nursing homes by writing a secret note in cursive that no one will be able to understand but us. We'll use a printed map to make our plans so nobody can track us on our phone, and then we'll make our getaway driving a stick shift, which no one will be able to follow us unless you've been to Europe lately, I think. So as Leslie mentioned, I'm Troy Beckert. I have a PhD in educational psychology, and I did my emphasis in lifespan development. Specifically, I looked at intergenerational learning within families. So I got to spend time teaching grandparents how to be better grandparents and adolescents how to be better grandchildren. It's been a really fun career. I've enjoyed so much of what I've done. And I was thinking about the transition to this particular talk, this discussion and presentation. And I thought, you know, there's a big difference between what I spend most of my time doing and this particular area. Specifically, grandparents, you just have to remind them how cute their grandchildren are, how cute they were when they were babies, and now look at them as they're growing up. For those of you who are in the older generation and you're working with Gen Zers, I'm not so sure I can convince you how cute they are or how much you remember them from when they were younger children. So I think that's going to be an interesting part of this discussion, is making that application across the board. I do want to just give a couple of caveats. I'm an educator. I'm not a presenter, and I'm definitely not a salesman. So because of these things, I want to make it really clear at the onset that my purpose is to provide some guiding principles. You can figure out how to apply them, and I think that might just be a good way to approach this. I also want to let you know that this is the very first time I've made this particular presentation. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Literally at 11:46, I finished the presentation. So it's going to be, and not because I delayed. I've been actually working on this for well over a month. I was fascinated. I was telling the two directors here, I was telling them before we started, I was fascinated at how little research, how little information there is on this particular topic. There's a lot of information on the generations and defining those generations, but there's less information on so what? What do you do once you've defined those generations? So I think it'll be an interesting conversation. If for nothing else, it'll get our minds moving in a direction, a common direction. Maybe we can establish some kind of common ground in this discussion. Another caveat before I jump into what I'd like to present is COVID. I mean, I don't know if I have to say much more. I think we need to cut ourselves and others a lot of slack. I think we need to have compassion. I think we need to try to empathize with what others are going through. Not everybody goes through pandemics the same way. I'm pretty sure for most of us, this is our first pandemic. I'm really hopeful this is our last pandemic. I don't know about those of you from younger generation, but I'm hoping that I'm well gone before we go through one of these things again. But it's novel. And anytime something novel is presented to any organism, any environment, any dyad or triad or group kind of dynamic, it introduces change. And so I think it's pretty important, even as we go through the discussion this afternoon, that we don't look for wild ideas to change course swiftly. I think it would be prudent to look for principles and look for ways that we can incrementally implement things to help us to better understand each other in this process. I did mention that this is on Zoom, which I'm not, I've been teaching on Zoom now for as long as the pandemic has been going, and I've gotten better at it over the course of time. We'll see, because I've got some videos integrated, and you never know what video might pop up when we're doing this. So if I have to, I've asked Leslie to be the host. So if at any point in time she needs to just drop me out of the conversation, I'd be fine with that. The other issue many of you heard when this thing started was this is being recorded. That always puts me in a bind, because I tend to speak extemporaneously and oftentimes say things that I probably shouldn't. So this is going to keep me focused. It's going to keep me in line, and certainly will keep me from swearing. So that's going to keep me moving in the right direction as we move forward. So with that in mind, let's get going and let's have a conversation. Today we're going to explore the similarities and differences between generations, and I'm going to put this in the context of the workforce. I want to look first at the historical makeup of generations. I want to make a few comments about that, about how that broad stroke is both helpful and really probably more so hurtful in our discussions. I want to look at differences between these broad stroked generational groupings, and then I want to look at similarities. And from that, we'll jump into some implications, some principle application that hopefully will serve us well as we move forward. I'm sure most of you are aware, but we live in a society that is ever changing. In fact, our society is referred to as a longevity society. Do you know we're only one of 43 societies where the average lifespan is over 80 years? So think about that for a minute, right? We have this opportunity to, on average, live more than 80 years. Well, if you look at that from a generational perspective, that means we're going to have 5 and sometimes 6 generations living at one time. That puts the workforce having at least 4 generations, and oftentimes up to 5 generations interacting. This is unprecedented. If we go back even just 3 generations of time, that was not the case. In fact, we had 3 generations, usually at most, and usually 2 solid generations that were in the workforce. Not only in the workforce, but if you think about this, in these modern societies, so these societies like ours, social transformations happen so rapidly that each successive generation experiences unique situations. So things that I experienced as a Generation X person, my parents experienced, but they only experienced them after their generation had transitioned to that next stage. And then my kids came along and they represent this millennial generation, and they experience things that are unique to them, unique to their situations. And I wondered if we could just take a minute or two. I wonder if you could just even put in the chat some examples that you can think of that were unique to your generation. Now, this doesn't mean that you're the only one who had them, because obviously future generations will have some part of them, although not everything. Like, I don't know how many of you know what a beta VHS is, but there are some things that don't pass on. But we also, older generation, will glean from younger generations. So maybe just throw into the chat if you can think of any examples that came on board during your generation's time. Yeah, okay, so here they come, right? And if you look at these, I should have almost had you put your age. I'm just kidding. See, there I go. I'm making these statements. We got HR in here and they're looking at me like, you can't say that. But we've got everything from floppy disks, laser disks, smartphones, the internet. Oh my goodness, the Oregon Trail computer game at school. I remember that. Yeah, first microwave. Thank you to Rachel for that one. I remembered our first microwave when my parents got it. We cooked a scrambled egg in there. It took about the same amount of time a scrambled egg takes on the stove, but it was fantastic to cook it in the microwave. Oh, the camcorders, we've got some great things coming up on the screen. Colored TVs, cable TV, from cable TV to streaming services. And yes, many of us still have cable TV. And I know I get told all the time how much too much I'm paying for my cable TV, but I like the features. So yeah, there you go. Anyway, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the legalizing of same-sex marriage, end of baby boomers, and I remember when colored TV came. Yeah. Okay, excellent. So we left off some of the fads that came and went, like the fidget widgets. Oh, that was just barely. Like the Pokemon Go. Anyway, yeah, we could probably spend the entire time. Here's my point with this. These unique situations create a peer dominant communication strategy that can lead to generational isolation. And I don't think it should be something that we look at as, oh my goodness, that's a horrible thing. It's something that happens naturally, organically. When we can converse with our peers about something that an older generation might not understand, it creates a cohort context. It allows us to bond together with same-aged individuals. We see other bonds that transcend generation, mostly within families. But if you look at these opportunities, they give us this moment of time that we share together. And for many of us, you'll remember, it was a big deal. Like, it was yours. It belonged to your generation. The thing that I want to point out as we looked through that list on the chat is that it's not unique to the newest generation. Every generation had this. Every generation was the cutting edge generation until we weren't. And then the next generation became the cutting edge generation. And so if we see this in this kind of big picture vision across the ages, we can appreciate the peer dominant communication as being something that is okay. It's the second part of that bullet that I think we want to spend some time talking about today, and that is generational isolation. I'm really quite amazed at how each generation feels that their argot, their way of speaking, their language is so unique. I actually have not seen it as strongly as we see it right now with this current generation, to the point where there are full dictionaries being written for Gen Z language. The problem with those dictionaries, by the way, if anybody's accessed them online, they change as quickly as they're printed out. So you have to be very careful, those of you who are a bit older, if you'd like to be in the know, I wouldn't even go to those sources, because you'll end up making, it doesn't go well. Just trust me. You use terms that were popular yesterday and not today. So let's look a little bit at how these groupings are put together. I hope I'm not offending anybody. I decided to start with baby boomers. There is still a generation, there might be two generations, but in the workforce, probably baby boomers are the oldest group that we have. Again, I'm not completely sure of that. These individuals were born between 1946 and 1964. So that makes them between 57 and 75 years of age. And then we have Generation X. These folks were born between 1965 and 1980. So they're between 41 and 56 years of age. We then have Generation Y, which nobody really liked that, because everybody was wondering, why are you, right? So we decided to move that one over to become millennials. These folks are born between 1981 and 1985. So that puts them between 26 and 40 years of age, making up really the bulk of our workforce here in the United States. And then the last group that we'll talk about today is the Generation Z group. Generation Z's from 1996 to 2010, probably. I think that's where we're going to end up cutting that one off. And so these folks are between 11 and 25 years of age. The current working name for the next generation is Generation Alpha. We've got 10-year-olds now that fit into that group. So full disclosure, and I don't mind full disclosure in this particular setting, because here we are sitting in Zoom land. I was a bit nervous to make this presentation. And those of you who are old enough to remember this, they used to give us these hints on how to survive making presentations. And one of the hints, you've probably heard it 100 times, was to picture everybody as if they're in their underwear, which I think is a horrible thing to tell people. And now in Zoom, the odds are many of you are in your underwear. So keep your cameras off, because we don't need that in our conversation. Now, full disclosure, I've always had a hard time with these generational cutoffs, because I was born in 1965. So I've always been this tweener right between the Gen X. I don't quite fit all of their goings on, and the baby boomers, and I don't quite fit into all of their goings on. And we see the same thing with folks born in 1981. Many of them, 1981, 82, 80, somewhere in that early range, maybe identify as much with the Generation X as they do with millennial. So it's kind of an interesting, these arbitrary break-off points that we have. Somebody's got to be born at the end and at the beginning of each of those. So let's highlight a few things for a minute. So let's start with our baby boomers. Actually, maybe we should do this. Leslie, can you launch that poll that I put up there? And let's just see if it'll work. I don't know if it will. But let's try to launch this poll. And okay, looks good. So would everybody give your votes there? And Leslie, you might be the one who gets to see the results of these. Maybe you can unmute yourself and tell us how this is looking.
Sure, you bet. I'll give everybody another 30 seconds here. All right, I've got 90% participation, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Oh, 92% now. So I'll go ahead and share the results. So you should all be able to see this. Can you see that okay?
Okay, yeah. Excellent. So we didn't have too many Gen Zers show up, but thank you to those who did. Our boomers are 13%, and then we've got the bulk of us fit into this Gen X and millennial group. So good. All right, excellent. Thank you for that. All right, so I want to just highlight a couple of things about these the differences between these generations. And in doing so, I do not mean any disrespect to anybody. What I would like to do is have you look at some videos that have been made that parody the different generations. And as you watch these 1 to 3 minute videos, I want you to look for a couple of things. First of all, I want you to look for what things are they highlighting about the generation. So, you know, positive, negative, the overall tone, but specifically, what are the characteristics that they're trying to highlight in these particular parodies. And then secondly, I want you to just try to consider which generation was probably responsible for making the parody. Okay, so just keep those two things in mind. We'll start with our first one, and hopefully this will work. Let's give it a shot.
Okay, you're a boom. Okay, boom. Do you say you're back in my day when you talk to someone useful? Do you moan all day at the news instead of doing something useful? Do you treat those service workers like they're nothing but your slaves? Are you further from your birth than you are closer to your grave? Boom. Okay, boom. You're a boom. Okay, boom. Book, good, phone, bad. When I was 25, I had a wife, was a dad. We worked 12 hours just to pay the bills. You'll just watch Netflix and chill. Can't use a drill, take too many pills. If the sea levels rise and you use vaccines, Wi-Fi, what's that? I got a Wi-Fi. Hey, I'd beat my kids if they stared at screens. Boom. Okay, boom. You're a boom. Okay, boom. Actually, I need your help. I got a strange thought in a weird place. Look, took a picture on my phone to show to the doc, and I somehow posted it on Facebook. Boom. Okay, boom. You're a boom.
All right, we don't need the shameless advertising that comes after it, but yeah, so there you go. Does somebody want to just jump in the chat and share with us where you think millennials made this boomer, because it's similar to MTV Start? Yeah, okay. Yeah, and this thing originated, this okay boomer, this derogatory term originated back in, I think it was in New Zealand, at a parliament meeting where someone from the millennial generation was speaking about global warming, climate change, and somebody had made a comment in through the, from the audience, and the person's reply was, okay, boomer. And it kind of grew into this, this idea that blossomed. There's some things that are unique about the boomer generation, and I want to highlight just a couple of them. These are found throughout the literature on developmental differences of individuals. Specifically, I highlight things that are in the workforce. So one of the things that characterizes those from the baby boomer generation is that they're considered workaholic. They put career ahead of all other things. That makes them more team-oriented. They also are considered optimistic as a generation. They have a real loyalty to their company. They have a sense of duty. Now, if this were open forum and we could really have an open discussion from Gen Z all the way through baby boomers, there's a bit of resentment from younger generations about that company loyalty, because much of that loyalty is also connected to pension plans, which for most who have come after the baby boomer generation, those are no longer options. So there's some tension that arises as one group maintains loyalty to their company. The other generations, successive generations, can often see that as a loyalty to a pension, even if that's not true. In fact, many of the baby boomers who have gone through these types of studies, these empirical studies, have referenced that there's more to it than this idea of pension, and yet it remains a part of their makeup. So if we continue on, and this is one of the things that I want to highlight as we transition past this, their communication preferences tend to focus on efficiency. For most in the workforce, it's generated by the computer, but they kind of go in order of face-to-face talking on the phone, or face-to-face talking on the phone, and then emails. And then if we need to, we'll text. They're the least likely group to have a favorable work-life balance of all of the successive groups and the group that came before them, actually. Another thing to keep in mind, those of you who are Generation X and millennials and Gen Zs, is that most baby boomers plan to continue working well past 65. So that kind of fits into this picture a bit as well. All right, let's move through. Next, we have Generation X, 65 to 80. Same thing, I'm going to show you a parody of Gen X. I want you to look for what is it that they're highlighting, good, bad, and who do you think made the video? So let's give this a try.
Yeah, everybody's talking about the boomers, millennials, and Gen Z. People talk generations and they mention those three. Our kids call us boomers. No, that's incorrect. We have our own name. It is Generation X. We may not use new technology very well, but we used to rock a chat room and AOL. No Bitcoin, but our 401k is decent, and we hate any music that is recent. We are Gen X. Gen X is in the house. You know how we're in the house? Because we say in the house. Speaking of being in the house, when we got home from school, our parents were gone as well. We're alone for 3 hours. There's a key under a shell. We did have computers, but there was just one game to play. It was Oregon Trail. Then we got dysentery. You guys are now learning how to write apps when you were 6. When I was 6, the only app I had was Mozzarella Sticks. But when your phone dies because your battery's crap, you're gonna need me, because I can read a map. We are Gen X. You can't plug in a destination. We are Gen X. You cannot find a location. How far away is that exit? You have to basically guess it. Hey, it's the weekend, so what you gonna do? Let's invite over millennials for Trivial Pursuit. It's Gen X's favorite game. It's where we try to use all of our knowledge to get 6 pieces of pie. Millennials, they all think they are smarter than me, but this game that was printed back in 1993. What's the highest grossing film of all time?
Avatar.
I'm sorry, it's Jurassic Park.
Nope, that's what it says right here in the car. I saw the one with Chris Pratt, but they made another one.
Dude, that's like number 30 now.
Sorry, we're right. Siri.
The Siri?
No.
Don't ask Siri.
What's the highest grossing movie of all time? Card is always right. Sure. Boomer. We are not boomers.
You calling us boomers, we're not boomers.
That's our parents.
We are Gen X. Our photos are on paper. We watched this.
All right, you get the idea. So anybody want to jump in there? Thanks for those who have jumped in, who recognize these folks. Why was this so accurate? Yeah, good question, Julia. Maybe made by Gen X. There's certainly an identity crisis going on for that group in that discussion. Okay, let's keep going. Let's talk a little bit about Gen X and then we'll move through. So they're considered flexible. They're considered informal. They're also considered skeptical. They put their personal interests over company interests, again, because they're not expected to work at the same company for their entire life. That's part and parcel for what they're going through. How do Gen X folks communicate? Once again, the emphasis is on efficiency. We've gone from the desktop computer to the laptop and even the phone, but the preference remains face-to-face, then phone, then email, then text. Some Gen Xers will even embrace instant messaging if necessary. So there's that approach. Let's move on to our millennials. 1981 to 1996. Same thing with our video parody. Let's begin.
Ding, 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 There he sits inside your local coffee shop, sporting a man bun and facial hair. Somehow he believes, although he has no job, that by his 30s he will be a millionaire. M-I-L-L-E-N-N-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. M-I-L-L-E-N-N-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. She posts lots of selfies on her Instagram with the quote that's inspirational. Hopes to change the world while wearing yoga pants, armed with her dreams and knowledge of essential oils. M-I-L-L-E-N-N-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. M-I-L-L-E-N-N-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. 27 years old, trying to make it on their own. Maybe stop by leaving your parents home, but maybe we're just wrong. Criticism isn't easy for their ears. They feel like they know most everything. See, they grew up with undeserving confidence, cause they got trophies just for participating. M-I-L-L-E-N-N-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. M-I-L-L-E-N-N-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. In a couple of years, we will have to pass the torch. In a couple of years, they will be in charge, and one will be our president. Oh no. M-I-L-L-E-N-N-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. M-I-L-L-E-N-N-I-A-L, please pray for millennials.
Okay, I had to stop it before it ended. Otherwise, somebody might say, hey, that Gen X guy played the millennial one the whole way through and cut the other two off early. So there you go. I don't know. It's a fun one. I see a lot of the people putting in the chat. It was made by millennials making fun of themselves, maybe older millennials who don't identify with being millennials. Yeah, it could be. Gen X made it. Gen X made it. Yeah, so interesting. What defines the millennial class? They're seen as competitive, achievement-oriented, and embracing diversity. And I want you to look closely at those as we compare them to the next generation, for Generation Z. They're also this comprises 70% of our workforce. Their communication preferences, instead of being on efficiency, they border toward ease. So phones, tablets, instant messaging would be a first choice back when this particular study came out, but texting, social media, emails, calls are okay if necessary, and yeah, so on. So now we get to the Generation Z group, 1996 to 2010. Only 4% of our group today fit into this. And I have a sad announcement to make. I do not have a video clip for them. I looked and looked and looked, and the only ones I could find were on TikTok, and they had language that I would not be allowed to put in this particular presentation. So, and I'm not going to encourage everyone to go and find them, but yeah, there is not a filter on TikTok, just in case you were wondering. Yeah, anyway, I'll move on. This group is referred to as digital natives in the literature. It's a term I've struggled with because I've always felt like I was a digital native because we had, you know, typewriters. Anyway, but this group has grown up on the internet. Their emphasis in the workforce is on diversity, equity, and individuality. Of all of our groups, the Gen Zs want to strike the best work-life balance. And their communication preferences, this is an interesting one because so much is changing right now with Gen Zs, but by and large, it's listed as phones only. Instant messaging, social media, text, and you know, most of the things that you'll read will say no calls. Well, that's only true if you don't have earbuds. If you have earbuds, then calls are okay. So most Gen Zs have never actually talked into a phone, but they do talk on their phone. They just use their buds to do that. All right, so these are our groups. All right, so if you take this just in broad sense, that's one thing. But there's also developmental differences that I want to highlight as we start to move through our discussion. I want to highlight two areas of development to illustrate this point, including how we develop in our careers and how we develop in our identity. So it's common and it's entertaining to use these broad strokes to label entire generations, but it's probably more important, it's probably more useful to recognize that as we develop, our knowledge, our goals, and our preferences change. So I want you to think about that just in the context of those videos that we were watching and not watching, which I think says a lot just about that particular group anyway. But yes, we have this identification, this cohort context that we identify with, but we're also aging. And as we age, we have our own developmental trajectories. So our cohorts continue through their phases, but we also change and develop. These developmental changes that we go through influence and reinforce our generational gap phenomenon. And that's part of the reason why we have fun. I hope everybody had fun poking at ourselves, not at the other groups. But if you look at this, I would just want to use these two lenses. The one has to do with identity and the other has to do with careers. And then I'll jump into some things that maybe we can do as we move forward. So Donald Super came up with this occupational goals developmental trajectory. And it goes like this. I'm just going to click through these so I can put them all up here at the same time. So what Donald Super was trying to tell us is that it's okay when we're young to go through a crystallization process. So this would be like when we're going through school, we're switching our majors, we're trying to figure out which major we want to do. We want to crystallize who we want to be when we grow up. And then we start to specify. So we get into a particular major if we're going to college, or a particular trade if we're going to a trade school, or if we're apprenticing, that we get with the right individual. And then we implement that career. Then we stabilize in the career. and then we consolidate within that career. So this takes us from our beginning stages in the career all the way till retirement. If you think about the group that we have with us today, we all fit somewhere along Donald Super's continuum, from crystallization through consolidation. It really doesn't make sense for me, who's in a stage of career of consolidation, to expect somebody who's in a crystallization or even specification stage to have the same investment in the job as I have. Now, Donald Super stopped, I think his last journal article was probably written right at the early or really late 1900s, maybe the year 2000 or so. I'm not sure of that, but anyway, it was 2 decades ago. And since that time, especially with the change in pensions and the way that we change careers, we're going to expect millennials to change careers 7 times before they get into the stabilization and consolidation phase. Gen Z is going to be higher than that number, we think. Something might change. It happens where the cohorts flop and all of a sudden we will see something monumental changing, but I'm not going to predict that. I would instead say that we'll probably see Gen Zs go through 10 iterations of their career. And, you know, most of us have seen that, and it's kind of part and parcel for young individuals. Well, if that's the case, then their investment is going to be different than those of us who have been in a career for 35 years. Another thing that I want to highlight has to do with our identity development. My favorite theorist is Erik Erikson. And Erik Erikson had these 8 stages of development, and no, there will be no test on these when we're done. I just want to throw them out there for discussion. So we go through our early childhood, and then we hit adolescence all the way through emergent adulthood. So this is going to take in people in our group here, all of our Gen Zers, and a decent swath of our millennials that are still grappling with identity. And one of the main pegs of identity for Erikson was work identity. If we're still working on stabilization, crystallization, and we're trying to get to a point of figuring out who we are, we're going to do some boneheaded things. We're going to do some things even in the workforce that when we look back 20 years later, we'll think, oh, that was really dumb that I did. But, you know, society needs to be able to adjust, be able to accommodate individuals as we grapple with trying to both explore who we want to be and then commit to that particular identity. For many of us in this particular group, we're in those last 2 stages, this generativity and integrity kind of stage. And you'll notice that Erikson put these things juxtaposed with some other approach that needs to be balanced. So if I'm in this generativity stage, I'm trying to balance generativity with stagnation. And at the same time, I'm working with individuals who are much younger than I am, who are just trying to figure out who they are, trying to figure out their own identity. Those two, while Erikson says should be able to coexist within the individual, often run into conflict between individuals. Because I don't want to have time for you, I'm speaking now from this generativity perspective, I don't want to have time to make time for you to explore your identity. I need you to help me to be generative in order to help me balance that stagnation. Well, if we turn to that other lens, if I'm trying to figure out who I am, I'm really not that interested in your generativity or in your integrity versus despair. And so there has to come a time where we as human beings who now coexist across these 5 and 6 generations, where we can take a moment, take a step back, and try to see from this other perspective. There's not a person in our particular group that can't do that. We all have the prefrontal cortex that's myelinated, pretty well at this point in our lives that we can use that executive functioner to take a moment and say, what are they going through? What are they experiencing? Why are they here? Why are they doing the job that they're doing? And as soon as I can wrap my head around that, then I can figure out how that person and I can coexist. And then better yet, how the two of us can cooperate and synergize towards something that would be more helpful. So here's where we find ourselves. If we use both that generational gap thesis, right, from baby boomer all the way down through Gen Zers, and we look through that developmental lens that we just looked at two things, the Donald Super's career development and Erickson's identity development. But if we put those two together, we can see where differences are more likely to manifest in the workplace. And front and center of that list would be communication. The way that we communicate, the preferences that we have for communication, the reasons that we communicate. Likewise, our motivation for why we're here, why we're participating even in this particular presentation. Why are we doing this? Our motivations would be different. And I think what I would like to do is just throw out a challenge to everybody to just think about this deeply for a moment. Think about what my motivations are for coming here. It's not uncommon in this type of setting for somebody to come to the presentation to find out what the other generation's doing wrong, as opposed to coming to say, okay, what can I learn about myself and how can I apply that to this intergenerational synergy that we're looking for. The way that we look at compensation, we've highlighted this a few times with pensions. It's on my mind because I've been reading a bunch of things about how pensions have been taken and the effects that those have had, that's tying directly actually to a lot of this unemployment and underemployment that we're dealing with right now. Our commitment levels are different across generations. And I know the bulk of our group came in as Gen X and Millennial. And if we only talked together, just those two groups, we would see these same things manifest. It's interesting that just like in families, the two middle children, so in this case, it would be the Gen X and the Millennials, tend to create a bond with each other. They do an alliance with each other and say, yeah, we're very similar. But if we lost the other two generations, then all of a sudden our similarities would look more like differences in our conversation. So in addition to commitment, we have differences in our experience. And this is, regardless of what department you're in or where, what your role is in your work, it's kind of an important fact that we recognize our experience level. We say that all the time to those who are novice, and we say, know that you still need to learn a lot, but we also need to flip that coin around and speak to older generation and say, you need to know what you know. And sometimes that's so much more than somebody who's just starting to work, that you need to take a step back, use a little zone of proximal development and scaffold someone along, because they can't know everything that we know. They haven't been on the job as long. And then this last bullet is the one that I've been trying to highlight over the last 20 minutes. We have embedded in our systems a cohort in context. So it's not, there's nothing developmentally wrong with cohorts hanging together. The problem runs into is when the cohorts hang together at the exclusion of the others. We all have to work together, but there is going to be a natural difference in how we view the world. Our context, our contextual lens is speaking louder than the community or the company lens is speaking to us. All that said, if you look in the literature on this particular topic, the generational, these generational differences, they're real, and we need to acknowledge them. We need to address them in order to foster a successful work environment. But we also should acknowledge that there's actually more similarities between the generations than there are differences. One of my favorite things to teach when I'm teaching grandparents how to be better grandparents is this topic. So many grandparents look at their grandchildren and say, oh my goodness, the world that they're growing up in is so different than the world I grew up in. It really is not. The differences are large, but the similarities are more. If you look at the Venn diagram of our workforce at Utah State University, you will see how similar we really are. In fact, across studies, we look at these things and just bullet point them out. Everyone should carry their own weight. Generations agree with this. And I know there might be some people here going, oh, I don't know about that Gen Z. They don't want to carry their own weight. They actually do. But it's the way we're viewing the weight that is different. Flexibility to be able to have work-life balance is shared almost universally, especially from Gen X all the way through. We want jobs that challenge us, and we want to be able to have the kind of training that we need to be able to develop in our jobs. And then finally, we want equitable compensation, which has become even more challenging. I'm just really fascinated by the movement that's happening with minimum wage. I've seen the minimum wage push come and go, but I've never seen the wave catch the way that it is now. And many of you in your particular divisions are dealing with the crunch because we work at Utah State University. If they raise the minimum wage too high, well, minimum wage is going to be more than we're making. So we're going to have to be, anyway, there's some things that push back. So how do we bridge the gap? How do we get to a point where, you know what, we're working together in this? I've just put together a few keys that I've been able to glean. Again, these are more principle-based. If you're serious about wanting to have an intergenerational workforce, I think you could use these and think for a moment and apply these principles to your own setting. And I think that they could have great benefit to any workforce. The first one I'll highlight is to customize our communication style. One of the most common complaints in industry is that younger employees don't respond in a timely manner to their communication. Much of that communication, the style of communication was initiated by the supervisor. It's on the supervisor's terms. So stereotypically, this would be, they don't reply to my voicemail, they don't reply to my email. Well, why are you still using email? Use text, use Slack, use instant messaging. All of these forms are actually easier. They're actually better for communication, but they're generally not the supervisor's style. So I think we go back to our original thought of how do we get generations communicating, and we let mentoring be intergenerational. Why don't we have bidirectional learning? It would make great sense to me to have somebody who understands Slack, for example. I don't like Slack personally, but who uses Slack, who's used it before, or can create a texting group. Once you have that in place, I'm speaking if someone here is listening, it's like, I like my email. It's okay, you can like your email, but there are more efficient ways. And I'll promise you this, Gen Zs will reply to a text a lot faster than they'll reply to an email. They just will. So anyway, so we can learn then from our coworkers, get them to help us set up the communication system that'll work for us. So we have this idea. That leads then, I think, to this idea of being willing to share control. I think we can have bidirectional expertise. within our workforce. Obviously, supervisors, you have the most expertise. No one is going to take that away. But what expertise can a brand new employee bring to the big picture of our discussion? And that's the wrestle, right? You can, if you'd like to spend a moment and think about it, you can get there. And I have found, at least in the intergenerational work that I've done within families, that once the older generation, and in that case, the grandparent, once the older generation initiates bi-directional expertise, bi-directional learning, then the younger generation responds in kind, recognizing that now, because we share a common moment, I can be more attuned to your expertise. And it helps. It doesn't mean you have to relinquish control. In fact, just the opposite occurs. You gain more control in that kind of thing. And then the other thing that I would add to this is, I'm not a real ropes course kind of person. I know a lot of people are, and I'm glad that everybody does them. But the one thing that ropes courses do that I've valued is that they provide this opportunity for a bonding experience. So we talked a little bit about these cohort contexts that are embedded in our workforce. This creates cohorts, and it allows for us to have shared experience. So, we can look for ways to do that. And then finally, we need to listen. Just listen to each other. And not so that we can speak next, but so that we can hear what somebody else is saying. Just to finish things up, older generations, oftentimes I'm speaking to myself, we should pause every once in a while and remember that we were once the younger generation. And as cool as we were then, this group is cool as well. And it's the circle of life. Younger generations, you need to be aware that pretty soon you're going to be the older generation. And you'll be the one in that situation. And that's okay. Finally, people of all ages can build relationships with each other. We can. And once we understand the differences, these different perspectives that other generations have, we can create a less fragmented workforce. Ultimately, navigating generational differences in the workplace is all about creating an environment where people understand and appreciate various views, various points of view, even if they differ from our own. So I think I am done. Any questions?
One of the things that I have noticed where you were talking is how to communicate with the new generations, right? One of the things you have to be able to listen to them. Sometimes if you're not listening, they're not going to pay attention to you, even if you're the supervisor.
Yeah.
You're trying to make sure that you work with them at the same token to see what you can do, see what their interests are. They're coming to a workplace, probably they haven't worked before, and they're going, well, this is all new to me. How could I improve? So I think one of the things that I have noticed is that I'm in a different area now, is that I have visited with the team. I've gone one-on-one with them, seeing how they're doing, what are their goals, what are their interests, and I've been able to talk with them. But sometimes is how we can come across. Are you going to come across as a really supervisor, or are you going to come, hey, I'm here to help you? And I think that's one of the things that I noticed, that as you work with them, as you see what their futures are, if you're interested in them, they're going to pay attention to you. They're going to come to you and ask you questions. And they say, hey, do you remember the time you sat down with me? How can I help you? I'm still here to help you. And I think that's one of the things that with these new generations of different people that we work with, we have to be able to help them no matter what they bring to the table. And be patient too.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I, Alex, thank you for those comments. And I'll just also add that as we learn about them, we should look for ways that we can learn from them, because that also provides that opportunity. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Troy, did you see this question from Morgan in the chat? So Morgan says, do you think improving intergenerational communication will influence public health?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I actually do think it will. And we've seen some, we actually did this little pilot study toward a bigger grant that COVID came along. So we're still in the, in the slower process. But one of the things we were looking at is intergenerational support. So social support as it relates to health. So I would wholeheartedly think that it would affect that, because our outlooks, right, regardless of our generation, can be supported. Thank you, Morgan. All right, Leslie.
Looks like we've got another one from Julie. Julie says, are there recommendations for types of activities to help build cohort cohesion in the
workplace? Yeah, that's a good question. And so here's what I've come across. I'm trying to remember, I was reading this particular article that I was reading in preparation for this, talked about the importance of allowing the younger generation to generate the activities, to generate the scope of the activities and the intent of the activities. And in at least these authors' purpose was to say that it creates that buy-in from the younger workers so that they're the ones who are planning and putting it forward. So, but they didn't have any specific activities listed, just that principle.
We have another question from Deandra. She says, as an advisor, how can I help students learn these skills as they're building their networks and preparing for the workforce?
Yeah. Do you know, my first answer is always good luck, but that's never a good approach to this. So an advisor to, I'm not sure what we're talking about with that. Oh, academic advisors. Yeah. Yeah. So learning these skills is really a matter of practice. It's not a real difficult task, because the skills revolve around simple communication. And simple communication, although it's difficult for a lot of us because we just want to be heard, simple communication is 2 parts listening, 1 part speaking. And so even with these students that you're working with as an advisor, to build their networks, it's a matter of asking questions. It's a matter of putting yourself in a position to be mentored by somebody else. We always look at that as being only, you know, in this case, it would be students being mentored by somebody who's career oriented, but we can also be mentored by peers. We can be mentored by those that we're mentoring. So it's that process of always wanting to learn, always wanting to glean, and at the same time being willing to give of our own knowledge, our own expertise, even when that's difficult for us because we don't feel like we know everything. Yeah.
I have a question. How do you communicate that with the supervisors that you have? You have supervisors that may be willing to work with you and some that do not listen and they want to do it their own way because they are the management or they are above you. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's probably the harder of them. Who's their supervisor? So this is the rub of this whole conversation, because as you noticed from the beginning of the presentation, it requires buy-in from both sides. In order for intergenerational growth to occur, both sides have to be willing to participate. And Alex, you bring a great point to the equation, because it's very often the supervisors who are the ones who are unwilling, unyielding. And their reasoning for it is, I've already done that, I've paid my dues, and now I'm in a position where I get to make the decision. But if you look at the history of the workforce, that actually worked 2 generations ago, because there was this rite of passage toward leadership, that when I became the boss, then it was my way or the highway. But we don't have that same environment anymore. So, the sad part of your question is that we're going to lose some of those supervisors, because if you're unwilling, unyielding in your approach, in the long run, that's not going to bode well in today's workforce. I'm a believer in what I presented today, that intergenerational communication, intergenerational cooperation is necessary. So I don't know that I really answered your question, because it's frustrating.
Yeah, I think you did. One of the things that I sometimes struggle, because as I'm a supervisor myself, I'm trying to learn more and to make sure that I can improve better. But sometimes when other supervisors think you seem that you're improving, but they are afraid that you may take their jobs. I'm not here to take their jobs. I'm just here to improve myself so I can make a better living for my family.
Right.
And sometimes it's like they feel like there's a threat towards that. And I'm going, well, there's no threat.
Yeah.
I may look for other resources to find my skills, but that's what I think. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that why do they feel threatened when they already have a position that either they can teach us or they can figure out a better way to communicate. Sometimes they may not listen to you because, like you're saying, they already know it all. So why worry about it?
Right. So incrementally, we just help individuals to see the growth that can come, because the truth of this is, it's not to placate the supervisor, like, just listen to someone else and then you can check a box. The truth is, by listening to somebody else, they will improve in their job. And so with time, hopefully incrementally, they'll see the benefit of that kind of exchange and see that their own work improves as a result. It will work. It just takes buy-in.
Troy, I have a question for you. What advice would you give to maybe a supervisor or manager who is leading those who are in older generations than them? I think sometimes there's a disconnect there. What advice would you give for that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's always one of the more delicate of the situations, because as I supervise somebody who's older than me, there's an assumption on both sides about knowledge, about expertise, and about the way that things should occur. So if you go back, Leslie, to this slide when we were looking at those differences that we had outlined, if you look for an opportunity to have bi-directional mentoring with somebody who's older than you, but for whom you supervise, and it's genuine and sincere in that I know there are things that you can teach me, not about my job, I'm going to do my job, but that you can teach me and help me and mentor me so that our overall work improves. That will benefit. I do think it's a mistake for supervisors of somebody who's older than them to go one down and say, you know what, you're older than me, so you kind of tell me what to do, and you can't go that route, because you are still a supervisor. You need to supervise. But by asking for bi-directional mentoring, asking sincerely for how would you handle this particular situation, you're validating that they have expertise.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Okay, I'll take the question. The question I have is, how do we improve better to communicate with those that are coming in now? I know, like, we have talked about this. What is a role model, or what can we do better as an employee of Utah State, or if you work in a different place? How can you do better? How can we improve better on those kind of things?
To communicate with new employees, meaning younger employees.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, one of the real balances that we talk about a lot. So I deal with adolescent development. That's who I've been teaching and talking about adolescence for a long time. And one of the real balances that we run into with this is, I was making a little bit of fun of the Gen Z language when we started this. The real secret is to treat them like adults and not like Gen Zers. That's their world. That's not our world. And anytime we try to infiltrate their world, and I don't mean the use of the technology. So to use text message is fine, but you know, we should probably not dip when it's time to leave. We should just say, I'm going to leave, in our communication style. So when we treat them like they've arrived, like they've grown up, that initiates that bidirectional learning. So it's really a simple approach, and that is one of respect and one of acknowledging that they're now a part of our team. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate spending some time with you and taking away your lunch.
Thank you for buying
Troy.
lunch.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now.
Okay.